Chapter 0, The Case of the Century. The file is opened. Phase 1, The Setup. This is a file that was never meant to be read aloud. Somewhere inside a locked cabinet in Washington, and somewhere inside a sealed archive in Beijing, two documents sit under two different stamps. One says top secret, the other says internal use only, do not distribute. They were written decades apart by men who never sat in the same room, yet they answer the same question. What happens when the country that built the machine realizes the machine has started building itself? Open the file with me. Picture a room with no windows. The lights are low, the air conditioning hums a little too loud, and on the table there is a single folder with a red string tied around it. A hand reaches for it, hesitates, then pulls the string loose. Inside there are photographs of container ships, printouts of wire transfers, transcripts of phone calls that were never supposed to exist on paper. This is not a courtroom. There is no judge here, no jury, no verdict waiting at the end of the hour. And yet this is the biggest case ever built. We call this the case of the century, and we mean it literally. Not a war of soldiers, not a war of bullets and trenches, but a war fought with balance sheets, with patents, with export licenses, and with something far more fragile than any weapon: trust. For most of modern history, wars had a beginning you could point to. A shot fired, a border crossed, a ship sunk. This war has no such moment. There was no declaration, no ultimatum, no midnight speech. It began quietly, in trade agreements signed with smiles and handshakes, in factories built with foreign money, in classrooms where young engineers were trained by the very people who would later call them rivals. It is a war built inside cooperation itself. So before we go further, we have to ask the one question that will follow us through every chapter of this file. Who created the dragon, and why does the very hand that raised it now want to hold it back? Keep that question close. We will return to it again and again because almost nothing in this story makes sense without it. Phase 2. The escalation. To understand how we got here, we have to go back and trace three waves. Not waves of water, but waves of money, machines, and ambition, each one carrying the world a little closer to where we stand today. The first wave came after the Second World War, when a handful of nations rebuilt the rules of global trade from the ashes. Factories moved, currencies were pegged, new institutions were born, to make sure no single country could ever again strangle the world's economy alone. China, at that time, was not yet part of this story. It was closed, poor, and largely invisible to global markets. The second wave arrived decades later, when technology shrank the distance between continents. Container ships grew larger, phone lines turned into fiber optic cables, and for the first time in history, a factory on one side of the planet could be managed like it was next door. This is the wave that opened the door. China, slowly and carefully, stepped through it. The third wave is the one we are still living inside. The wave of data, algorithms, and invisible supply chains stretching across dozens of countries just to build a single device in your pocket. This is the wave where China did not simply join the game. It began writing new rules of its own. Three waves, one country moving from the edge of the map to its very center. And to understand exactly how that happened, this file will need to open 6 smaller files inside it, each one a chapter of its own. The trade file, where tariffs and treaties hide decisions that reshaped entire industries. The technology file, where a single microchip becomes more valuable than an oil field. The currency file, where the true weapon is not a missile, but the number printed on a piece of paper called a dollar or a yuan. The espionage file, where blueprints, patents, and secrets moved across borders long before anyone noticed. The geopolitics file, where ports, roads, and alliances are drawn not for trade, but for control. And finally, the Taiwan file, the single point on the map where every other file eventually collides. 6 files, one long war, and a warning before we go any further. Many of the truths inside these files will not match what you have already been told. Some of what the news called cooperation, we will show you as extraction. Some of what the news called aggression, we will show you as self-defense. This is not because the news lied to you. It is because a case this large is never told from just one side of the table. Our job in every chapter that follows is to open both sides at once, lay them side by side, and let you draw your own line between them. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So here is the map of the case we are about to build together, chapter by chapter, like a detective pinning threads across a board. We begin in chapter 1 with the uncomfortable truth that the United States did not simply watch China rise, it helped design the ladder China climbed. In chapter 2, we open the espionage file and ask whether what happened over the following decades was theft, or simply the same shortcut every rising power in history has taken. In chapter 3, we shrink down to the size of a single microchip and discover how something smaller than a grain of rice became the most fought-over object on Earth. In chapter 4, we follow a mineral most people have never heard of and learn how China turned raw earth into a weapon no army can fire. In chapter 5, we step into the world of currencies, where a single decision by a central bank can move faster and hit harder than any army. In chapter 6, we relive the opening shots of the trade war and expose who really paid the price for every tariff signed into law. In chapter 7, we enter a battlefield with no soldiers at all, a war fought entirely inside people's minds, through screens, headlines, and algorithms. In chapter 8, we travel across ports and highways built far from either country's own soil and uncover a quiet contest for the loyalty of the entire developing world. In chapter 9, we arrive at the single most dangerous point on the map, an island whose name alone can move global stock markets overnight. In chapter 10, we turn the camera inward and reveal the cracks growing inside both giants, cracks neither side wants the other to see. In chapter 11, we step back far enough to ask whether this entire war was ever truly avoidable or whether history has seen this exact story before. And in chapter 12, we open every remaining file at once, lay out the possible futures on the table, and ask what role you, the listener, might play in a world being redrawn in real time. 12 chapters, one long investigation, and it all begins with a question we are not ready to answer yet. Before we can open the war file, we have to go back almost 50 years to a single handshake that history remembers as peace, but that this file will show you as something else entirely. Who signed the birth certificate of their own future rival? That is where we open chapter 1. If this file has already pulled you in, do not close it here. Follow this channel so the next file lands the moment it is opened. And if you believe this case deserves to be seen by more eyes, leave a like before you go. And every one of them keeps this investigation running. Chapter 1 begins now. Chapter 1, the country that built its own rival. Phase 1, the setup. Open the file again. This time, the date on the first page reads the year 1972. A plane touches down in Beijing, and for the first time since the Communist Revolution, an American president steps onto Chinese soil. Cameras flash, translators lean in close. Two governments that had spent more than 20 years calling each other the enemy now shake hands in front of the entire world. History remembers this moment as the beginning of peace between two civilizations. This file will show you something colder, something far more calculated. The real target of that handshake was never Beijing. It was Moscow. By the early 1970s, the United States was trapped in a war it could not win in Vietnam and locked in a decades-long standoff with the Soviet Union that showed no sign of ending. The strategist behind the China trip, the national security advisor who had spent months arranging secret meetings before the president ever boarded that plane, understood one simple law of power. If you cannot defeat two enemies at once, you split them apart. China and the Soviet Union, despite sharing the same communist ideology, had grown into bitter rivals. They had fought border skirmishes. They distrusted each other's ambitions in Asia, and Washington saw the crack and decided to drive a wedge straight through it. So when the American president sat across from the Chinese leadership in that guarded room in 1972, the conversation was never about human rights, never about opening Chinese markets to Western goods, never about lifting millions of people out of poverty. It was about geometry. It was about turning a two-sided Cold War into a three-sided one, where the weight of China could be used to pin down the Soviet Union. China, for its part, walked away from that meeting with something just as valuable: legitimacy, breathing room, and a powerful new counterweight against a Soviet military buildup on its own northern border. Both sides got exactly what they wanted. Neither side at that moment was thinking about the other's economy. But while Washington was busy playing its Cold War chess, a much quieter figure was rising through the ranks in Beijing, one who would spend the coming decade rewriting China's entire relationship with the outside world, and who would do it using a strategy so patient, so deliberately invisible, that most of the West would not notice its full effect until it was far too late. His name was Deng Xiaoping, and the doctrine he built for China's rise can be summed up in 6 words, borrowed from ancient Chinese strategic thought: hide your strength, bide your time. This was not a doctrine of aggression. It was the opposite. It told China's leadership, its diplomats, its generals, and its economic planners to avoid confrontation, avoid drawing attention, avoid triggering the very alarm bells that might cause the West to slow China down before it had the chance to grow strong. Grow quietly, build quietly, and only reveal your true strength once it can no longer be stopped. For the next 2 decades, that is exactly what happened, and almost no one in Washington was watching closely enough to see the pattern forming. Phase 2. The escalation fast forward nearly 30 years to the year 2001. The file we open now is not about diplomacy or military strategy. It is about a single vote inside the World Trade Organization, a vote that would do more to reshape the global economy than almost any war of the 20th century. China was applying to join the World Trade Organization, the institution that sets the rules for nearly all international trade. Membership would mean lower tariffs, guaranteed market access, and the kind of legal protection that would make China an irresistible destination for foreign investment. Inside Washington, the debate over whether to support China's entry was fierce, but it was not evenly matched. On one side stood an alliance of multinational corporations, free trade economists, and foreign policy strategists who argued that bringing China into the global trading system would inevitably make it more open, more democratic, and more aligned with Western interests over time. Commerce, they argued, was the greatest tool of political transformation the world had ever known. On the other side, a smaller, quieter group of labor economists, industrial policy experts, and a handful of lawmakers from manufacturing states raised a very different warning. They said that China's economy did not operate like a normal market economy. State-owned banks could direct nearly unlimited credit toward favored industries. Currency values could be managed to keep Chinese exports artificially cheap, and a labor force of hundreds of millions willing to work for a small fraction of an American wage would not simply raise all boats together. It would pull entire industries out of the United States almost overnight. Those warnings were written down. They exist today in transcripts, in policy papers, in congressional testimony that anyone can still find in public archives. But at the time, they were treated as the fears of a shrinking minority, buried under a much louder chorus of optimism about global trade lifting every economy at once. The vote passed. China joined the World Trade Organization, and the second wave of this story began. Almost immediately, a flood of American corporations began moving their manufacturing operations to China. This was not a slow trickle. It was a deliberate, strategic, board-approved wave known as offshoring, and it was driven by one of the simplest calculations in business. Labor in China cost a small fraction of labor in the United States, and moving production there could multiply profit margins overnight. Major American retailers built entire supply chains around Chinese manufacturing, sourcing enormous portions of their shelves from Chinese factories. Industrial giants shifted heavy manufacturing operations overseas, chasing lower costs and looser regulations. Even companies that built their reputation on American innovation eventually assembled the vast majority of their most iconic products in Chinese factories, shipping the finished devices back across the Pacific to be sold at premium prices. For shareholders, this was a golden age. Costs fell, profits climbed, stock prices soared to record highs quarter after quarter. But every one of those decisions carried a cost that would not show up on a balance sheet for years, sometimes decades. And that cost had a name and an address. It was called the Rust Belt. Across the industrial heartland of the United States, entire towns had been built around a single factory, a single steel mill, a single assembly line. When that factory closed and its work moved overseas, it did not simply eliminate jobs. It hollowed out the entire local economy built around those jobs. The diner that fed the workers closed. The hardware store that supplied the factory closed. The schools lost funding as families moved away, searching for work that no longer existed nearby. Economists would later calculate that the wave of Chinese import competition following China's entry into global trade eliminated millions of American manufacturing jobs, concentrated overwhelmingly in specific regions, specific towns, specific families who had built their entire lives around industries that vanished within a single generation. This is the human price hidden beneath every headline about rising global gross domestic product. The aggregate numbers looked wonderful. Global trade expanded, global poverty fell. But averages hide wounds, and the wound in the American industrial heartland would fester for years before anyone in Washington was willing to call it by its true name. And here is the paradox sitting at the very center of this chapter, the twist that this file wants you to sit with for a moment before we move forward. China did not break the rules to achieve this rise. China followed the rules, the very rules the United States had spent decades designing and championing, and simply played that game with more discipline, more patience, and more long-term strategic focus than almost anyone in Washington expected. The latter had been built by American hands, engineered by American trade lawyers, approved by an American vote. China simply climbed it faster and higher than the architects had ever imagined possible. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So what did all of this actually produce 20 years later when we finally step back and look at both sides of the ledger? On one side of the Pacific, a Chinese middle class was born that the world had never seen before. Setting. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of extreme poverty within a single generation, a transformation almost without precedent in human economic history. New cities rose, new highways connected them. A new class of Chinese consumers began buying cars, apartments, and smartphones at a scale that reshaped global markets. On the other side of the Pacific, an entire generation of American industrial workers watched their towns empty out, their pensions shrink and their children move away to find opportunities that no longer existed at home. The same trade policy that built a new middle class in China left behind a hollowed-out working class in America, angry, distrustful of the institutions that had promised them prosperity, and increasingly convinced that the entire system had been rigged against them from the start. That anger did not disappear. It did not fade quietly into economic statistics. It waited, and years later, it would become one of the most powerful political forces in modern American history, fueling a wave of populist anger that would eventually reach all the way to the White House itself. But that political explosion is a story for a later chapter in this file. For now, remember this. The factory floor was only the visible surface of this war. Underneath it, in places far less visible to ordinary citizens on either side of the Pacific, an entirely different battle had already begun. Not a battle over cheap labor and container ships, but a battle over blueprints, patents, and the very technology that would define the next century. It was fought quietly, in corporate research laboratories and university science departments, in boardrooms where lawyers negotiated the fine print of joint venture agreements, and in the offices of engineers who did not yet know they were standing on the front line of an economic war that history had not yet given a name. That is the file we open next, the file on economic espionage, where the question stops being who worked harder and starts being who took what from whom, and whether what happened next should be called theft or simply the price every rising power in history has learned to pay. Chapter 2 begins now. Chapter 2. The espionage file. The greatest theft in history. Phase 1. The setup. Open the file. This one begins not in a palace or a parliament, but in a quiet American suburb, in a house with a 2-car garage and a lawn that needed mowing. An engineer walks out to his car one morning, coffee in hand, ready for another ordinary day at a company that builds some of the most advanced wind turbine software on Earth. He does not know it yet, but federal agents have been watching him for months. Inside his personal email account, investigators had already found something worth more than gold: the complete source code that controls how a wind turbine converts moving air into electricity. Code that took his employer years and hundreds of millions of dollars to perfect. He had not stolen it for himself. He had sold it. And on the other end of that sail sat a Chinese wind turbine manufacturer that, almost overnight, no longer needed to buy the American company's technology at all. It simply had a copy. Within a matter of years, that same American company watched its Chinese client, once one of its largest customers, cancel every remaining contract, walk away completely, and become one of its most aggressive global competitors, selling turbines built on stolen code at a fraction of the original price. The American company's stock collapsed by more than 80%. Thousands of jobs disappeared. And the engineer who handed over the blueprint eventually pleaded guilty in a foreign court, serving a prison sentence that lasted barely a single year, a tiny fraction of the damage his signature had caused. This is not a rare story pulled from the shadows for dramatic effect. It is one file among thousands sitting inside a much larger investigation, an investigation that the Office of the United States Trade Representative and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have tried year after year to put an exact price tag on. Their estimates place the annual cost of intellectual property theft to the American economy somewhere between $225 billion and $600 billion every single year. Read that number again. It is not the cost of a single scandal. It is the estimated yearly toll of a theft so large, so continuous, that American officials have called it the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And that is exactly the file we open now. Phase 2, the escalation to understand how a theft of this scale could happen in plain sight over decades, without a single dramatic headline announcing it all at once. We need to trace 3 separate paths, 3 very different methods that all led toward the same destination. The first path was built directly into the rules of doing business in China. For decades, foreign companies seeking access to the Chinese market in industries ranging from automobiles to aerospace to renewable energy were required as a condition of entry to form joint ventures with local Chinese partners. On paper, this looked like a simple business partnership. In practice, it often meant handing over detailed technical specifications, manufacturing processes, and proprietary designs as the literal price of admission. Western executives, hungry for access to a market of more than 1 billion consumers, signed these agreements willingly, calculating that short-term technology sharing was a fair trade for long-term profit. Many of those executives would later admit, quietly, that they had underestimated exactly how quickly their local partners would absorb everything they had been taught, and then no longer need them at all. The second path left no paper trail whatsoever because it was never meant to be legal in the first place. This was state-sponsored cyber espionage, conducted not by lone hackers working from a basement, but by organized military units operating with the resources of an entire government behind them. In the year 2013, a private cybersecurity firm published a report that shook corporate boardrooms across the world. The report identified a group known publicly as Advanced Persistent Threat Number 1, traced directly back to a specific unit inside the Chinese military, operating out of a nondescript office building in Shanghai. Investigators concluded that this single unit had systematically infiltrated the computer networks of well over 100 companies across nearly every major industry, from steel and satellites to information technology and financial services, quietly extracting terabytes of proprietary data over a period of years, often undetected for months at a time. This was not petty theft. This was industrial-scale intelligence gathering, conducted with military discipline, targeting exactly the technologies that mattered most for China's long-term economic ambitions. And the third path was, in some ways, the most elegant of all, because it required no hacking and no coercion whatsoever. It simply required an invitation. China's government launched a program known as the 1,000 Talents Plan, designed to recruit brilliant scientists and engineers, many of them ethnically Chinese researchers, who had spent years building careers inside American and European universities and laboratories, and offer them extraordinary financial incentives to bring their expertise back home. Generous salaries, research funding, prestigious titles. For many participants, this was nothing more than a legitimate career opportunity, a chance to contribute to their homeland's scientific rise. But for American investigators, it became one of the most difficult threats to police, because the line between legitimate academic collaboration and the quiet transfer of sensitive, sometimes government-funded research became almost impossible to draw with any precision. 3 paths, 1 destination. And now the argument that sits at the very center of this chapter, the argument you will hear echoed in every diplomatic exchange between Washington and Beijing for the next 2 decades. Chinese officials, when confronted with these accusations, have offered a defense rooted deeply in economic history itself. Every rising industrial power, they argue, has learned by copying the power that came before it. The United States, in its own 19th century industrial rise, borrowed freely from British textile technology, sometimes through outright industrial espionage of its own. Japan and South Korea, during their own post-war economic booms, built entire industries by reverse engineering Western products before eventually surpassing the very companies they had learned from. Learning, adapting, and catching up, China's defenders argue, is simply how development has always worked, and singling out China's version of this process as uniquely criminal ignores centuries of precedent. American officials reject that comparison entirely. What separates this case, they argue, is scale, coordination, and intent. This was not scattered private companies quietly reverse engineering products on their own initiative. This was a deliberate, centrally coordinated national strategy, blending state-directed industrial policy, military cyber operations, and academic recruitment programs into a single, unified effort to acquire foreign technology as quickly as possible, regardless of the legal or ethical lines crossed along the way. What China calls learning and catching up, the United States calls systematic plunder, conducted at a scale no rising power in history had ever achieved before. And if you want a single case that captures this entire argument in miniature, there are 2 files worth pulling from the archive. The first is the wind turbine case we opened this chapter with, the case that came to be known by names of the 2 companies at its center, an American superconductor company and its former Chinese partner. That case ended not just in a stolen piece of code, but in the near total destruction of an American company's global business, a lawsuit measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and a diplomatic scandal that made headlines around the world. The second is a case involving a Chinese telecommunications giant and an American mobile carrier. The telecommunications company had been granted access to test a piece of specialized robotic equipment used to test smartphone durability. Technology the American carrier had spent significant resources developing internally. Investigators later alleged that an employee of the Chinese company had secretly photographed the robot's components and even attempted to remove a physical piece of it from the testing lab, smuggling it out in a laptop bag. A civil jury eventually found in favor of the American company, awarding damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars, in a case that became one of the most closely watched corporate espionage trials of its era. 2 cases, 2 industries, 1 unmistakable pattern. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So what happened once Washington finally decided it had seen enough? The response was not subtle. The United States Department of Justice launched a sweeping initiative formally aimed at prosecuting economic espionage and trade secret theft connected to China, but which quickly expanded into something far broader and far more controversial: an aggressive review of academic researchers, university scientists, and visiting scholars, many of whom had never been accused of any wrongdoing at all, simply because of their national origin or their research collaborations with Chinese institutions. Visa restrictions tightened. University research partnerships came under intense scrutiny. Chinese graduate students in sensitive scientific fields found themselves facing suspicion that had nothing to do with their individual conduct. And prominent Chinese-American scientists, some of whom had spent decades contributing groundbreaking research to American universities, found themselves investigated, publicly named, and in several highly publicized cases, later cleared of all charges entirely, their reputations and careers already shattered by the accusation alone. The initiative would eventually be quietly shut down years later, following widespread criticism that it had veered dangerously close to racial profiling within America's own scientific community, damaging exactly the kind of open academic collaboration that had made American universities the envy of the world in the first place. But by then, the damage on both sides had already been done. Trust between American and Chinese research institutions, built over decades of genuine scientific partnership, had been badly, perhaps permanently fractured. And here is where this file must close for now, because the theft of a blueprint, however costly, however dramatic, is still fundamentally a story about copying something that already exists. The next file we open is about something far more difficult to steal and far more difficult to replace: the physical control over an entire global supply chain concentrated in the hands of a small number of companies, machines, and factories that the rest of the world cannot function without. Blueprints can be photographed, code can be copied onto a memory stick, but you cannot smuggle an entire factory out in a laptop bag. And that is exactly why the next battlefield in this war would not be fought over stolen designs at all, but over something almost impossibly small and almost impossibly powerful: a microchip. Chapter 3 begins now. Chapter 3, the chip war, the smallest jewel, the largest weapon, phase the setup. Open the file, and this time look closely, because the object at the center of this chapter is so small you could lose it inside a fold of paper. Hold a single grain of rice between two fingers. Now imagine something smaller than that grain, thinner than a fingernail, etched with billions of microscopic switches invisible to the human eye. That object is called a semiconductor chip, and inside this file, it is not an exaggeration to say that this tiny sliver of silicon can decide the fate of an economy built by 1.4 billion people. Every fighter jet that flies, every missile that guides itself to a target, every smartphone that unlocks with a glance, every artificial intelligence model that learns to think a little more like a human being, all of it depends on chips like this one. And here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire chapter. No single country on Earth, not even the two superpowers at the center of this file, can produce these chips entirely on its own. Instead, the world's most advanced semiconductors are built through what investigators inside this industry often call a power triangle. 3 points on a map, each one holding a piece of a puzzle that only becomes dangerous once you understand how tightly it is locked together. The first point on the triangle sits inside the United States, home to the companies that design the blueprints for the most advanced chips ever created, translating abstract mathematics into physical patterns of unimaginable complexity. The second point sits on a small island in the Pacific, Taiwan, home to a single manufacturing company that has quietly become perhaps the single most important and most dangerous company on the planet, producing more than 9 out of every 10 of the world's most advanced chips inside a handful of factories clustered along its western coastline. And the third point sits far from either superpower, in the Netherlands, home to the only company on Earth capable of building the extraordinarily precise machines required to carve these chip patterns using a technology known as extreme ultraviolet lithography, machines so complex that a single one can cost more than the price of a private jet and takes months just to ship and assemble. Design in America, manufacturing in Taiwan, equipment in the Netherlands, 3 points, one triangle, and China. Despite being the world's largest single market for finished electronics, sits almost entirely outside of it. That is the vulnerability this entire chapter is about to expose. Phase 2. The escalation. To understand how Washington chose to weaponize that vulnerability, we need to open 2 connected files: a law passed inside the United States Congress and a tightening set of export restrictions that followed close behind it. The United States passed a piece of legislation known as the CHIPS and Science Act, committing over $50 billion in direct government subsidies to rebuild American semiconductor manufacturing capacity on domestic soil, an enormous bet that decades of offshoring critical chip production could be at least partially reversed. But the more aggressive weapon inside this file was not the money spent building factories at home. It was the restrictions placed on what could leave the country at all. Washington moved step by step, year by year, to block the export of the most advanced chip-making equipment to China, most critically, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines built by that single Dutch company. Without access to these machines, China's factories could produce chips for washing machines and basic electronics, but they remained locked out of the most advanced generation of processors needed for cutting-edge artificial intelligence and military applications. Washington did not stop there. It pressured allied governments to adopt matching restrictions, turning what began as a single American policy into a coordinated multinational blockade around China's most advanced technological ambitions. And no single company felt the full weight of this blockade more directly than one of China's own technological crown jewels, a telecommunications giant that just years earlier had been racing to become the dominant global supplier of fifth-generation wireless network equipment. The company's chief financial officer, who also happened to be the daughter of its founder, was arrested in Canada at the request of United States authorities, accused of violating international sanctions related to trade with Iran. The arrest triggered a serious diplomatic crisis, straining relations between three governments at once and turning one woman's extradition case into a symbol of the entire technological Cold War unfolding around her. Soon after, Washington placed the company itself on a trade blacklist, cutting it off from the American software and semiconductor components it had relied on for years, including the operating systems and chip designs at the heart of its smartphone business. The company's global smartphone market share, which had once rivaled the world's largest manufacturers, collapsed within a matter of a few short years. But here is where this file takes its first sharp turn, because the story does not end with collapse. It ends with adaptation. Cut off from foreign software, the company built and deployed its own operating system across hundreds of millions of devices. Cut off from foreign chip designs, it poured enormous resources into designing its own processors domestically. It could no longer buy the most advanced components from outside, so it turned inward, forcing a level of technological self-reliance that few analysts inside Washington had believed was possible on such a short timeline. And at the national level, China's response mirrored the same instinct on a far larger scale. Beijing poured enormous state-directed investment, measured in the trillions of yuan, into building an entirely domestic semiconductor industry from the ground up. A Chinese chip foundry, determined to become China's answer to the Taiwanese manufacturing giant it could no longer fully rely on, began producing increasingly advanced chips using older generation equipment it already owned, squeezing performance gains out of machines that were never designed to reach that level of sophistication in the first place. Progress was slower, more expensive, and far less efficient than the cutting-edge alternative China had been cut off from. But progress, unmistakably, continued. And this is the twist sitting at the very heart of this chapter, the one worth pausing on before we move forward. Sanctions, export bans, and blacklists are designed to slow an adversary down. And in the short term, they very often succeed at exactly that. But history keeps offering the same uncomfortable lesson to whoever tries to wield this weapon. Cutting off a rival's access to foreign technology does not just create short-term pain. It also creates the single most powerful incentive imaginable for that rival to stop depending on you altogether, and to build the capability themselves with, no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes. China's leadership had spent years discussing the danger of relying too heavily on foreign technology suppliers, warning internally about vulnerabilities in its own supply chains. Those warnings had often struggled to compete for funding and attention against faster, cheaper alternatives available on the open market. The American export bans did something no internal warning had fully managed to do. They made the threat undeniable, urgent, and impossible to ignore any longer. In trying to slow China down, Washington may have inadvertently handed Beijing the single most effective argument it needed to accelerate its own technological independence. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So what did this entire confrontation ultimately produce once the dust settled across both sides of the Pacific? The global technology industry, once a single interconnected web of shared suppliers and shared standards, began splitting into two increasingly separate ecosystems. Multinational corporations that had spent decades building supply chains without regard for geopolitical borders were suddenly forced into an uncomfortable new reality, choosing sides. Companies building artificial intelligence systems had to decide whether their most advanced processors would come from American design houses, cutting them off from China's market for their finished products, or whether they would try to serve China's massive market using less advanced, domestically sourced alternatives, sacrificing performance to maintain access. Governments allied with Washington faced pressure to restrict their own companies from selling advanced equipment to Chinese customers, even when those sales represented billions of dollars in lost revenue. And governments with closer ties to Beijing found themselves courted aggressively, offered investment and partnership in exchange for standing outside the blockade. Washington was trying to build. The era of one single, unified global technology supply chain was ending. In its place, two rival technological ecosystems began forming, each one slower, more expensive, and less efficient than the single global system that had preceded it, but each one increasingly insulated from the other's ability to apply pressure. And here is where this file must pause, because a chip, no matter how advanced its design, is built from raw physical materials that have to be mined, refined, and processed somewhere before they ever reach a factory floor. And in exactly that overlooked corner of the supply chain, China holds a card that almost no one outside this industry saw coming. A card so overlooked, so seemingly mundane, that most of the world barely noticed China quietly building an overwhelming, almost total advantage in it. That card is called rare earth elements, a group of minerals essential to everything from electric vehicle motors to precision-guided missiles. And China currently controls the vast majority of the world's capacity to refine them into usable form. It is a resource few people had ever heard of before this war began. And it is about to become one of the most dangerous weapons in this entire file. Chapter 4 begins now. Chapter 4, The Hidden Weapon, Rare Earths, Minerals, and the Supply Chain of Survival. Phase 1, The Setup. Open the file, and this time, forget the factory floor entirely. Forget the laboratory, forget the boardroom. This chapter begins underground, in dust, in mud, in mines that most people will never see a single photograph of. Here is a fact that sounds almost too strange to be true, and yet it sits at the center of one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities in the entire global economy. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the world's refined rare earth elements, the specialized minerals essential to magnets, batteries, and precision electronics, pass through Chinese hands before they ever reach a factory anywhere else on Earth. Not 60 to 70% of the mining, 60 to 70% of the refining, the critical, hard to replicate industrial process that turns raw ore into something a factory can actually use. You can mine rare earth ore almost anywhere on the planet. Dozens of countries have deposits sitting in the ground right now. But mining the ore is the easy part. Refining it into usable material requires enormously complex, environmentally hazardous chemical processing, and over several decades, China built a near total monopoly on exactly that step, the one step almost no other country bothered to compete for. And in the year 2010, the world got its first terrifying glimpse of what that monopoly could actually do. A Japanese Coast Guard vessel collided with a Chinese fishing boat near a small cluster of disputed islands in the East China Sea, islands that both Japan and China claimed as their own. The captain of the Chinese vessel was arrested. Diplomatic tensions between Tokyo and Beijing spiked almost overnight. And then, quietly, without any formal announcement linking the two events, shipments of rare earth elements from China to Japan began slowing down. Japanese manufacturers, who relied on Chinese rare earths for everything from hybrid car batteries to precision electronics, suddenly found themselves facing shortages, delayed shipments, and skyrocketing prices. China never officially admitted to weaponizing its rare earth supply as retaliation for a territorial dispute. But the timing, the scale, and the sudden reversal once the diplomatic crisis eased left little doubt in the minds of officials in Tokyo, Washington, and every other capital paying close attention. This was not a coincidence. This was a demonstration. A quiet, deniable rehearsal for a weapon China now knew it could deploy again at a moment of its own choosing against any country foolish enough to depend entirely on Chinese supply. Phase 2. The escalation here is the question that should be sitting uncomfortably in your mind right now. If this vulnerability is so obvious, so dangerous, why did the United States, a country with some of the most advanced mining and industrial capabilities on Earth, allow itself to become so dependent on a single foreign supplier in the first place? The answer lies in a single mine in the California desert, a place called Mountain Pass. For decades, Mountain Pass was the largest rare earth mine on the planet, and the United States dominated global rare earth production almost entirely on its own. But starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, a combination of tightening environmental regulations, falling global prices driven by cheaper Chinese competition, and a broader American strategic shift towards services and finance over heavy industry made the mine increasingly unprofitable to operate. It closed. And as it closed, China, willing to accept the environmental costs that American regulators were no longer willing to tolerate, quietly absorbed the market share the United States walked away from. It was not a single dramatic decision. It was a slow drift spread across 2 decades made by dozens of separate actors, none of whom were thinking about what might happen 30 years later when the world would suddenly need these obscure minerals more urgently than at any point in human history. And today, the list of industries that cannot function without them reads like an inventory of the entire modern economy. Electric vehicle motors depend on powerful rare earth magnets to convert electricity into motion. Wind turbines rely on the exact same magnet technology to generate power efficiently at scale. Precision-guided missiles and advanced fighter jets depend on rare earth components for their guidance systems and radar technology. And even the smartphone sitting in your pocket right now contains multiple rare earth elements, invisible, unlabeled, and utterly essential to the device working at all. Every single one of these industries quietly sits downstream of a supply chain that a single country controls the majority of. Washington, once this vulnerability was finally taken seriously at the highest levels of government, began scrambling to build an alternative. The United States signed new mineral partnership agreements with Australia, home to substantial rare earth deposits of its own, and with Canada, seeking to build a parallel, allied supply chain outside of Chinese control. American diplomats fanned out across Africa and South America, negotiating access to lithium, cobalt, and rare earth deposits in countries that had, for years, quietly built closer economic ties with Chinese state-owned mining companies instead. But here is the uncomfortable truth. These new partnerships cannot solve quickly. Mines take years, sometimes over a decade, to move from initial discovery to full commercial production. Refining facilities take additional years to build and certify. China's dominance was built over more than 30 years of sustained, patient investment. It cannot be replaced in a single presidential term, no matter how much political urgency now surrounds the effort. So let us sit inside a hypothetical for a moment, the kind of scenario that keeps defense planners awake late into the night. Imagine China decided tomorrow to completely halt all rare earth exports to the United States. What would actually happen over the following 6 months? In the first weeks, existing stockpiles would absorb most of the shock, and most consumers would notice nothing at all. By the second month, specialized manufacturers, particularly in defense electronics and advanced batteries, would begin reporting component shortages, quietly at first, then more urgently as existing inventories ran low. By the fourth month, production delays would begin rippling outward into consumer-facing industries, electric vehicles, wind energy projects, and consumer electronics, as manufacturers scrambled to find alternative suppliers who simply did not yet have the refining capacity to absorb the sudden demand. And by the sixth month, certain highly specialized defense production lines, missile guidance systems in particular, could face genuine, serious disruption. Precisely the kind of vulnerability that defense planners have spent years quietly wargaming in classified briefings that rarely reach public attention. 6 months. That is roughly the window most analysts believe separates a stable supply chain from a genuine national security crisis if this single lever were ever pulled all the way. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So, here's what this chapter leaves behind once we close this particular file and set it back on the shelf. Controlling raw materials is, in many ways, a silent weapon. It does not require a single soldier, a single warship, or a single act of visible aggression. It simply requires patience, decades of quiet industrial investment, and a willingness to tolerate environmental and economic costs that rival nations were no longer willing to bear themselves. And yet, despite its silence, this weapon carries the power to paralyze the defense industry of the most powerful military on Earth, simply by controlling access to minerals most citizens have never even heard the names of. That is the paradox sitting at the heart of this entire investigation. The most dangerous weapons in this war are not always the loudest ones, but raw materials and microchips, as powerful as they are, still represent something you can touch, something you can dig out of the ground or etch onto a silicon wafer. They are, in the language of this investigation, the muscle of the global economy. There is something else entirely, something far less visible, that keeps that muscle moving at all, something that can move faster than any ship, cross any border without a single customs inspection, and strike an entire economy without a single physical object ever changing hands. That something is money itself, the currencies, the reserves, and the invisible financial plumbing connecting every economy on Earth to every other. And in that file, a war has been quietly unfolding for far longer and far more dangerously than almost anyone outside a handful of central banks has ever fully understood. Chapter 5 begins now. Chapter 5, the currency file. The dollar, the yuan, and the financial nuclear weapon phase 1, the setup. Open the file and let us begin with a single question, the kind of question that has kept Treasury officials awake long past midnight in secure briefing rooms on both sides of the Pacific. What happens if China decided to sell $800 billion worth of United States Treasury bonds all at once within a single week? Sit with that number for a moment. $800 billion is not a rounding error. It is not a minor adjustment to a portfolio. It is roughly the size of an entire national economy, dumped onto the open market in the span of 7 days. Bond prices would collapse. Interest rates on American debt would spike overnight. Borrowing costs for the United States government, for American businesses, for every family with a mortgage or a car loan would surge without warning, and the shockwave would not stop at America's shores. It would tear through global financial markets from Tokyo to London to Frankfurt within hours. This is not a hypothetical dreamed up by this file for dramatic effect. It is a scenario that has been formally war-gamed inside the United States Treasury Department, inside the Federal Reserve, and inside China's own central bank, treated with the same seriousness usually reserved for military contingency planning. Because here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the entire global financial system. The United States dollar is not simply a currency. It is a weapon quietly built into the architecture of nearly every international transaction on Earth. Roughly 9 out of every 10 foreign exchange transactions worldwide involve the dollar on one side of the trade. Oil is priced in dollars. The majority of global trade, even trade that has nothing directly to do with the United States, is settled in dollars. And the pipes that move that money around the planet run largely through a single messaging network known as SWIFT, the Belgium-based system that allows banks in different countries to communicate securely about international payments. Washington does not need to fire a single missile to cripple another nation's economy. It simply needs to instruct SWIFT to cut a country's banks off from that network entirely, severing them from the global financial bloodstream in an instant. This is a weapon with no physical form, no visible battlefield, and no need for a single soldier to ever leave home. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful weapons the United States possesses. Phase 2, the escalation. So why, given how obviously dangerous this weapon is, has China spent decades accumulating trillions of dollars worth of the very currency and the very government bonds that give Washington this exact leverage over the world? The answer lies in a trap so elegant that economists have given it a name almost as unsettling as the scenario itself: the balance of financial terror. For decades, China ran enormous trade surpluses with the United States, selling far more goods to American consumers than it purchased in return. This arrangement generated an enormous flow of dollars into Chinese hands, dollars that needed to be invested somewhere safe, liquid, and stable. United States Treasury bonds, backed by the full faith and credit of the world's largest economy, became the natural destination for those dollars, year after year, decade after decade. But here's the trap. Once China had accumulated enough treasury bonds, currently among the largest holdings of any foreign nation on earth, selling those bonds suddenly, aggressively, became almost as dangerous for China itself as it would be for the United States. A sudden, massive sale would crash the value of the very bonds China still held onto, destroying enormous amounts of Chinese national wealth in the process. China cannot simply weaponize its treasury holdings without also detonating a bomb inside its own reserves. This is why, for decades, China kept buying almost against its own better strategic instincts, because the alternative, walking away from the dollar system entirely, seemed even more destabilizing than staying locked inside it. But staying locked inside a trap is not the same as accepting it forever. And over the past decade, China has been building patiently and deliberately an entirely parallel financial infrastructure designed for a single long-term purpose: reducing its dependence on the very system it remains trapped inside today. China built its own cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, designed to eventually offer an alternative to SWIFT for transactions conducted in Chinese currency. It launched a digital version of its own currency, the electronic yuan, giving Beijing direct, programmable visibility and control over a currency designed from the ground up to eventually operate outside the dollar-denominated financial system entirely. And it began signing an expanding web of bilateral currency swap agreements with trading partners around the world, allowing those countries to settle trade directly in Chinese yuan, quietly reducing the number of transactions that ever needed to touch a dollar or pass through a system Washington could ultimately control at all. And then in the year 2022, the world received a live demonstration of exactly how devastating Washington's financial weapon could be, and exactly why China's quiet preparations over the previous decade suddenly felt less like caution and more like foresight. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its allies moved to cut major Russian banks off from the SWIFT network entirely, freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. Russia's currency briefly collapsed. Its access to international trade financing evaporated overnight. China's leadership watched this unfold with extraordinarily close attention. The lesson was unmistakable. Any country that keeps the overwhelming majority of its foreign reserves inside a financial system controlled by a potential adversary is, in effect, handing that adversary a loaded weapon and hoping it is never pointed in their direction. China's efforts to accelerate what analysts now call de-dollarization, reducing reliance on the dollar across trade, reserves, and international settlements, moved from a slow, patient, multi-decade project into something with noticeably more urgency behind it. And here at last is the twist sitting at the very heart of this chapter, the one that explains why, despite everything you have just heard, neither side has ever actually pulled the plug completely. Both nations are locked inside what game theorists call mutual assured destruction, borrowed directly from the language of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. If China dumped its treasury holdings, it would devastate the United States economy, but it would simultaneously destroy an enormous portion of China's own national wealth in the process. If the United States moved to cut China off from the dollar system entirely, the way it did to Russia, it would inflict enormous damage on China's economy. But it would also send shockwaves through American financial markets, given how deeply intertwined the two economies remain after decades of trade and investment. Neither side can pull this trigger without shooting themselves in the process. This is precisely why the currency file remains, for now, the most dangerous weapon in this entire war that has never actually been fired. Phase 3. The resolution and the hook. So what has all of this produced? In the years since China began quietly building its alternative financial infrastructure, the world has begun fracturing, slowly, into competing currency blocks. The group of major emerging economies known as BRICS, including China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, along with an expanding list of new members, has spent recent years actively discussing alternatives to dollar-dominated trade exploring new payment systems, and in some cases, settling bilateral trade directly in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. None of these efforts have come anywhere close to actually dethroning the dollar as the world's dominant reserve currency. The sheer scale, liquidity, and trust built into decades of dollar dominance cannot be replicated overnight, no matter how many new payment systems get announced at diplomatic summits. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. The world that once ran through a single financial highway is slowly, deliberately building parallel roads alongside it, roads designed specifically to be resilient against exactly the kind of financial weapon this chapter has just described. And here is where this file must pause, because currency, for all its power, is ultimately just a tool, a mechanism for measuring and moving value between two parties who have already decided to trade with each other in the first place. To understand why this entire war has proven so difficult to resolve, so resistant to simple diplomatic compromise, we need to open a far more bitter file, one filled not with central bank reserves and payment networks, but with tariffs, trade deficits, and a trade war that began not as an abstract financial maneuver, but as a series of very public, very deliberate political decisions that would reshape global commerce and inflict real, measurable pain on factories, farmers, and families on both sides of the Pacific. Chapter 6 begins now. Chapter 6, the tariff war from one administration to the next, a war that never stopped. Phase 1, the setup. Open the file and set the date to the year 2018. Inside the West Wing of the White House, a decision was being finalized that would, within hours, ripple across container ports, factory floors, and farm fields on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. The President of the United States signed an order imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports, the opening shot in what would become the largest trade conflict between the world's two largest economies in modern history. The announcement did not arrive quietly through a formal State Department briefing. It arrived the way so many major decisions of that era did, through a public statement delivered directly to millions of people at once, blunt, immediate, and impossible for markets to ignore. But the decision to pull that trigger had not been unanimous, not even within the president's own inner circle. Inside the White House, two very different camps had spent months arguing over exactly this moment. On one side stood a group of trade hawks, led by the United States Trade Representative and a senior White House trade advisor, both of whom had spent years building the intellectual case that China's trade practices amounted to a form of economic warfare disguised as normal commerce, and that only sustained, aggressive tariffs could force meaningful structural change in Beijing's behavior. These were not new voices suddenly discovering China skepticism. They had been warning about exactly this outcome for decades, largely ignored by the free trade consensus that had dominated Washington since the World Trade Organization vote we examined back in Chapter 1. On the other side stood a group of more market-oriented advisors, including the Treasury Secretary, who worried openly that an aggressive tariff campaign risked destabilizing financial markets, provoking damaging retaliation against American exporters, and ultimately raising costs for the very American consumers and businesses the policy claimed to protect. The hawks won that argument, and the tariffs went into effect. Phase 2, the escalation. So who actually paid for these tariffs once they took effect? This question sounds simple, but it sits at the center of one of the most contentious economic debates of the entire trade war. And the answer is more complicated and more uncomfortable than either side of the political spectrum wanted to admit at the time. A tariff is not a tax paid directly by a foreign government or a foreign factory. It is a tax collected at the border, paid by the American company importing the goods in question. The political argument behind the policy assumed that Chinese exporters, desperate to maintain access to the massive American consumer market, would absorb much of this cost themselves, lowering their prices to offset the tariff and keep their goods competitive. Multiple academic studies conducted by economists at institutions, including the Federal Reserve and several major universities, reached a strikingly consistent conclusion. The overwhelming majority of the tariff costs were passed directly through to American importers, and ultimately to American consumers in the form of higher prices on everything from washing machines to furniture to industrial components. Chinese exporters, in aggregate, absorbed only a relatively small share of the total cost through lower prices of their own. This does not mean the tariffs accomplished nothing. They did succeed in reducing the overall volume of direct trade between the two countries, and they did impose genuine measurable costs on specific Chinese industries targeted by the policy. But the popular narrative that China alone was footing the bill never matched what the economic data actually showed, a gap between political messaging and academic evidence that would continue to define this entire trade war for years to come. Beijing's response arrived quickly, and it was aimed with striking precision, not at random American industries, but at a very specific political vulnerability. China imposed retaliatory tariffs heavily concentrated on American agricultural exports, soybeans, pork, and other commodities produced overwhelmingly in rural farming states, many of which had voted heavily for the very administration now waging this trade war. This was not a coincidence. It was a calculated political message delivered in the language of trade policy rather than diplomacy. The economic pain of this conflict would land directly on the president's own political base, in states whose support he could not afford to lose heading into future elections. American soybean exports to China collapsed by more staggering percentages within a single growing season, forcing the administration to authorize billions of dollars in emergency subsidies just to keep American farmers financially afloat during the standoff. Subsidies that, in effect, meant American taxpayers were now indirectly compensating American farmers for a trade war fought largely in their name. After roughly 2 years of escalating tariffs, tit-for-tat retaliation, and genuine economic pain on both sides, the two governments signed what became known as the Phase 1 Trade Agreement in January of the year 2020. Under its terms, China committed to dramatically increasing its purchases of American agricultural products, energy, and manufactured goods over the following 2 years, in exchange for a partial rollback of some planned American tariffs. China did not come close to meeting those purchase targets. Independent economic analyses conducted after the agreement's 2-year window closed found that China's actual purchases fell dramatically short of the commitments made on paper, achieving only a fraction of the promised totals across nearly every category outlined in the agreement. The global disruption caused by the pandemic beginning in early 2020 certainly complicated matters, disrupting supply chains and demand patterns worldwide. But even accounting generously for those disruptions, the shortfall was severe enough that independent trade analysts characterized the agreement's implementation as one of the most significant unmet commitments in recent trade history, a quiet failure that received remarkably little sustained attention once the political news cycle moved on to other crises. And then came a twist that surprised many longtime Washington trade watchers. When a new administration took office in January of 2021, led by a president who had spent years criticizing his predecessor's approach to nearly every other policy area, the tariffs on Chinese goods were not lifted. They remained almost entirely in place, and in several sectors, the new administration would go on to add additional targeted restrictions of its own. The new administration did shift its rhetorical framing, moving away from the blunt, confrontational language of decoupling entirely from China toward a more carefully calibrated strategy officials began describing as de-risking, reducing dependence on China in specific, strategically sensitive sectors like advanced semiconductors and critical minerals, while still maintaining broader economic engagement in less sensitive areas of trade. The language changed. The underlying policy of sustained economic pressure on China, remarkably, did not. Two administrations, built on opposing political philosophies, disagreeing loudly on almost every other issue facing the country, had arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion regarding China, that the economic relationship built over the previous 3 decades needed to be fundamentally restructured, whatever the short-term cost. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So what did years of tariffs, retaliation, and unmet agreements ultimately produce once we step back and look at the global supply chain as a whole? Manufacturers around the world watching this conflict drag on with no clear resolution in sight, began making a strategic calculation of their own. Rather than betting their entire supply chain on a relationship between two governments that showed no sign of genuine reconciliation, many multinational companies began deliberately diversifying production away from China entirely, a strategy that came to be known as friend-shoring, relocating factories to countries considered more politically aligned with, or at least less directly caught in the crossfire of, the broader United States-China rivalry. Vietnam experienced a dramatic surge in foreign manufacturing investment, absorbing electronics and textile production that had previously been concentrated almost entirely inside Chinese factories. Mexico saw a similar wave of new manufacturing investment, driven partly by proximity to the American market and partly by a growing preference among American companies for supply chains closer to home. And India, with its enormous domestic labor force and improving industrial infrastructure, began attracting increasing attention from global electronics manufacturers eager to build an alternative to their Chinese production base without abandoning low-cost manufacturing altogether. And none of these countries could fully replace China's manufacturing scale in the short term. China's industrial base, built over more than 3 decades, remains larger, more integrated, and more efficient than any single alternative currently available. But the direction of global supply chains had unmistakably shifted, and that shift shows no sign of reversing itself anytime soon. And here's where this file must close, because trade wars, tariffs, and unmet agreements represent the most visible, most publicly debated battlefield in this entire conflict. Reporters cover it, politicians campaign on it, economists argue about it on television. But there is another battlefield in this war, one far less visible, that does not show up in trade statistics or tariff schedules at all. It is a battlefield fought not over goods crossing a border, but over ideas crossing directly into the minds of billions of ordinary people. Through the screens they check dozens of times a day, through the headlines they scroll past without a second thought, through algorithms quietly deciding what they see, what they believe, and who they ultimately trust. That battlefield has no tariffs, no treaties, and no clear rules of engagement at all. And it may end up shaping the outcome of this entire rivalry more than any factory, any chip, or any tariff ever could. Chapter 7 begins now. Chapter 7, The Invisible Front, the War for Perception, Media, and Belief. Phase 1, The Setup. Open the file, and this time, put down the idea of factories, chips, and treasury bonds entirely. This chapter takes place somewhere far less visible, somewhere that does not appear on any customs form or trade statistic at all, inside the mind of an ordinary person, scrolling through a phone late at night, deciding, often without even realizing they are deciding, who to trust. For years, a piece of intelligence quietly circulated among diplomats and policy analysts, observing a noticeable shift in how Chinese diplomats and state media handled criticism from the outside world. Where an earlier generation of Chinese diplomacy had generally responded to foreign criticism with restraint, careful language, and behind-the-scenes negotiation, a newer generation of officials and state-affiliated commentators began responding publicly, aggressively, and often personally, confronting foreign journalists, governments, and critics directly on social media platforms and in televised statements. Journalists covering Chinese foreign policy began referring to this new posture using a nickname borrowed from a popular Chinese action film franchise, Wolf Warrior. Diplomacy, a name that stuck because it captured something real, a visible shift from quiet diplomatic patience toward loud, combative public messaging. Around that same period, a Chinese-owned short video application had become one of the most downloaded, most culturally influential apps among young people across the United States and much of the Western world, reaching hundreds of millions of active users and reshaping how an entire generation consumed news, entertainment, and political commentary alike. These two developments, one a shift in diplomatic tone, the other the meteoric rise of a single entertainment app, might seem unrelated at first glance. But inside this file, they belong to the exact same investigation because both raise the same underlying question, one that sits at the very center of this entire chapter. Is this war only being fought over factories, tariffs, and semiconductors, or is it also quietly being fought over something far harder to measure: the version of the truth that billions of ordinary citizens around the world ultimately choose to believe. Phase 2. The escalation. Let us open the first file inside this chapter properly. The argument over that same short video application and whether the controversy surrounding it was ever really about data security at all. United States officials raised concerns that the app's Chinese parent company could, under Chinese national security law, be compelled to hand over American user data to Chinese government authorities, or could be pressured to manipulate the app's content recommendation algorithm to subtly influence what American users saw and believed. The company repeatedly denied ever sharing American user data with Chinese authorities and proposed a series of technical safeguards intended to firewall American user data from any possible foreign government access. But critics of the security argument raised an equally serious counterpoint. Several major American technology and social media companies had already been shown in previous years to collect enormous amounts of user data with far less regulatory scrutiny applied to them, and none of those companies faced anything close to the level of government pressure now being directed at a single foreign-owned app. This asymmetry led some analysts to argue that the underlying dispute was never purely about protecting user privacy at all, but rather about something closer to old-fashioned industrial protectionism, dressed up convincingly in the language of national security, aimed at limiting a foreign competitor's extraordinary cultural and commercial influence over the American information ecosystem. Both arguments, notably, can be true at the same time. Genuine data security concerns and genuine competitive anxiety are not mutually exclusive motivations, and untangling exactly how much weight each side carried inside actual government decision-making remains one of the most contested questions in this entire file. Now let us open the second file: the dueling narrative strategies each government has deployed to shape how the rest of the world understands this rivalry. China's messaging strategy, delivered through state media outlets, diplomatic statements, and an expanding network of international partnerships, has consistently emphasized a story of respectful non-interference, mutually beneficial development, and a rejection of what Beijing frequently characterizes Western hypocrisy, arguing that the same countries lecturing China about human rights and democratic values built their own historical wealth through colonialism, resource extraction, and military intervention across large parts of the developing world. The United States, meanwhile, has consistently framed this rivalry using the language of a fundamental values conflict, describing the competition as a struggle between democratic governance and authoritarian control, a framing designed to rally traditional allies in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere around a shared ideological cause, rather than presenting the conflict as a narrower dispute over trade balances and technological advantage. Both narratives are carefully constructed, strategically deployed, and this file must note plainly, both contain elements of genuine truth alongside elements of convenient political simplification. China's critique of Western historical hypocrisy is not baseless. The United States' framing of authoritarian governance, real substance as well. The danger, for any listener trying to understand this rivalry clearly, lies in accepting either narrative in its complete, unquestioned form, rather than recognizing both as competing tools in an active information war. And behind both narratives sits an entire ecosystem of institutions working, often quietly, to reinforce them. Universities, research institutes, and policy think tanks on both sides of the Pacific have increasingly become battlegrounds of their own, with funding sources, research partnerships, and academic exchange programs facing growing scrutiny over whether they represent genuine scholarly inquiry or quiet vehicles for shaping public and political opinion in one direction or another. Researchers on both sides have faced accusations, sometimes fair, sometimes wildly overstated, of producing work shaped more by funding pressure than by objective analysis. So where does this leave the rest of the world, the countries not directly steering this rivalry, but watching it unfold from the sidelines, forming their own opinions about who deserves more trust? Public opinion surveys conducted across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe over recent years reveal a genuinely mixed, often contradictory picture, one that resists the simple story either Washington or Beijing would prefer to tell. In parts of Southeast Asia, many governments and populations express deep economic reliance on Chinese trade and investment, while simultaneously voicing real anxiety about China's growing military assertiveness in the region, producing a relationship best described as cautious, transactional coexistence rather than clear alignment with either superpower. Across parts of Africa, Chinese infrastructure investment has generated significant goodwill in many countries, even as concerns about debt sustainability and labor practices attached to some of those projects have grown louder in recent years. And across much of Europe, deep economic ties with China coexist uneasily alongside genuine unease about human rights concerns and growing worries about strategic dependence on Chinese supply chains, producing a continent that remains, in the language of policy analysts, deliberately unwilling to fully choose a side. No single region has fallen neatly into either camp. This is not a clean binary contest for global loyalty. It is a fragmented, constantly shifting landscape of competing interests, competing narratives, and competing trust, playing out differently in nearly every region of the world. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So what has this invisible war of narratives ultimately produced after years of dueling messaging campaigns, restricted platforms, and increasingly polarized public opinion? The world's information ecosystem, once at least loosely connected through shared global media platforms and shared international institutions, has begun splitting into increasingly separate spheres of belief. Citizens in different parts of the world consuming increasingly different sources of news, increasingly different social media platforms, and increasingly different official narratives are, in a very real sense, coming to understand the exact same underlying events in fundamentally different ways. This is not simply a story about misinformation or propaganda or bias, though all three certainly play a role. It is a deeper structural shift, one in which the very idea of a single, shared global understanding of current events is quietly eroding, replaced instead by parallel, competing ecosystems of truth, each internally consistent, each convincing to the audience it was built for, and each increasingly difficult to reconcile with the other. And here's where this file must pause, because a war fought over perception and narrative, however consequential, still ultimately unfolds mostly inside minds and inside media feeds. There is a far more concrete, far more physically consequential arena where this rivalry is also playing out, one measured not in headlines or hashtags, but in ports, highways, railways, and loan agreements stretching across dozens of developing nations. A quiet, patient contest for something even more valuable than public opinion: the long-term economic and strategic loyalty of the very countries caught directly between these two competing superpowers. That contest has a name, and it stretches across 3 entire continents. Chapter 8 begins now. Chapter 8, the fight for allies, the Belt and Road against the Indo-Pacific Phase 1, the setup. Open the file and this time travel with us to a port on the southern coast of Sri Lanka, a place called Hambantota, far from any battlefield, far from any headline-grabbing summit, and yet quietly one of the most important case studies in this entire investigation. In the early 2000s, Sri Lanka's government took out substantial loans from Chinese state-owned banks to build a massive new deep water port, envisioned as a transformative piece of national infrastructure that would turn a relatively quiet stretch of coastline into a major shipping hub. The port was built. The ships, however, largely did not come, at least not in the volumes the original projections had promised. Traffic through the new facility fell dramatically short of expectations, and Sri Lanka found itself struggling under the weight of debt it had taken on to build a project that was not generating anywhere near enough revenue to repay it. In the year 2017, unable to meet its debt obligations, Sri Lanka's government agreed to hand over a majority stake in the port, along with a long-term lease exceeding 90 years, to a Chinese state-owned company, effectively transferring operational control of a strategically significant piece of national infrastructure directly into Chinese hands. Western analysts quickly seized on this case, labeling it a textbook example of what came to be known as debt trap diplomacy, a strategy in which China allegedly offers developing nations large, difficult to repay loans for ambitious infrastructure projects, fully anticipating that some borrowers will eventually default, allowing Beijing to seize strategically valuable assets in exchange for debt relief. Chinese officials and several independent economists have pushed back hard against this characterization, arguing that Sri Lanka's debt crisis stemmed primarily from mismanagement by its own government, excessive borrowing from a wide range of international lenders, not Chinese loans alone, and broader macroeconomic pressures that had little to do with any deliberate Chinese strategy. Sri Lanka, they note, owed far more money in total to Western and multilateral lenders combined than it owed to China specifically. This file will not pretend the truth here is simple. Both interpretations contain real evidence behind them. But whatever the precise intent behind the original loan, the outcome remains undeniable and strategically significant. A Chinese state-owned company now controls long-term operational rights over a major port sitting directly along one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, barely a short sail away from Indian waters, in a location China's own naval planners have described as strategically valuable for decades. That is the case study opening this entire chapter, and the question it forces us to confront. Is China's global infrastructure ambition, genuine economic development, deliberate strategic entrapment, or more uncomfortably, some tangled combination of both at once? Phase 2, the escalation to understand the true scale of what China is building. We need to step back and look at the entire initiative this single port belongs to, the Belt and Road Initiative, announced by China's leadership in the year 2013, and since expanded into one of the largest infrastructure investment programs in human history. The initiative encompasses ports, railways, highways, pipelines, and telecommunications networks spanning well over 100 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, financed overwhelmingly through loans from Chinese state-owned banks and built overwhelmingly by Chinese state-owned construction companies. China's own government has described the initiative's purpose in the language of shared prosperity and mutual development, positioning Beijing as a generous partner, offering developing nations the infrastructure investment that Western institutions had for decades been reluctant or too slow to provide themselves. Critics inside Washington and European capitals see a different strategic purpose entirely, one that has less to do with generosity and more to do with quiet, long-term geopolitical positioning. Every port China helps finance and build, they argue, becomes a potential future node in a global network of strategic access points, useful for commercial shipping today, but potentially useful for Chinese naval logistics tomorrow, should relations with the host nation or with the broader Western alliance system ever deteriorate significantly. Not every Belt and Road project has succeeded. Several major projects across multiple continents have been quietly renegotiated, scaled back, or abandoned entirely, and after cost overruns, corruption scandals, or local political backlash made the original terms untenable. China's own banks have, in recent years, become noticeably more cautious about extending new large-scale loans, having absorbed hard lessons from several high-profile defaults and renegotiations across the initiative's first decade. Washington's answer to this sprawling initiative did not arrive as a single, unified counter-program with comparable scale. Instead, it arrived as a patchwork of overlapping strategic partnerships, gradually assembled across multiple administrations, all oriented around a single broader concept known as the Indo-Pacific Strategy. The United States revived and substantially strengthened an informal security dialogue known as the Quad, bringing together the United States, Japan, India, and Australia in a framework explicitly designed to counterbalance China's growing influence and military assertiveness across the Indo-Pacific region. A separate, more narrowly focused security partnership known as AUKUS, joining the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, moved forward with plans to provide Australia with advanced nuclear-powered submarine technology, a capability intended specifically to project deterrent naval power across exactly the waters. China's own military buildup had increasingly come to dominate. But between these two competing frameworks sit dozens of individual countries, particularly across Southeast Asia, forced into an increasingly delicate balancing act that regional diplomats have taken to calling walking the tightrope. Vietnam offers perhaps the clearest example of this balancing strategy in action. Vietnam maintains deep, complicated historical tensions with China, rooted in centuries of conflict and a more recent brief but bloody border war. Yet Vietnam's economy remains heavily intertwined with Chinese trade and supply chains. At the very same time, Vietnam has deliberately deepened its security and economic relationships with the United States, welcoming American investment, engaging in expanded military cooperation, and positioning itself as an attractive alternative manufacturing destination during the very friendshoring wave we examined back in Chapter 6. The Philippines has followed a similarly careful, if occasionally more turbulent, path, alternating between periods of warmer engagement with Beijing and periods of renewed, closer security cooperation with Washington, depending heavily on the political priorities of whichever administration happens to be in power in Manila at any given moment. And here is a twist worth sitting with carefully, because it complicates any simple story of a unified Western alliance standing firmly against China. Even among Washington's closest, most historically reliable allies, genuine strategic unity has proven far harder to maintain than official statements at diplomatic summits tend to suggest. Several major European economies maintain deep, extensive trade and investment relationships with China, relationships their own domestic industries, particularly automotive and industrial manufacturing sectors, remain heavily dependent on for continued profitability. These same European governments frequently find themselves caught in an uncomfortable position, publicly aligning with Washington's rhetoric on strategic competition with China, while privately resisting policies that would meaningfully damage their own economic ties to the Chinese market. This tension between shared democratic values and divergent economic interests has produced real persistent friction inside the Western alliance system. Friction that Beijing's own diplomats have, at various points, quietly sought to exploit and widen wherever the opportunity presented itself. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So, what has more than a decade of competing infrastructure investment, competing security partnerships, and competing diplomatic courtship ultimately produced across the developing world? The clean binary alliance structure that characterized much of the Cold War, countries clearly aligned with Washington on one side, countries clearly aligned with Moscow on the other, has simply failed to reemerge in this new rivalry. In its place, a far messier, far more layered system of overlapping, sometimes contradictory relationships has taken shape. Countries routinely accept Chinese infrastructure investment while simultaneously deepening American security cooperation. Countries publicly champion democratic values in one diplomatic forum while quietly negotiating favorable trade terms with Beijing in another. Loyalty in this new landscape has become something far more conditional, far more transactional, and far more difficult for either superpower to fully secure or fully rely upon. This fragmented, multi-aligned world may ultimately prove more stable than a rigid, binary Cold War structure, since no single crisis can instantly force dozens of countries to simultaneously choose one clear side. But it also means neither Washington nor Beijing can count on reliable, unconditional support from nearly anyone, a reality that complicates strategic planning on both sides in ways that rarely make it into public diplomatic statements. And here's where this file must pause, because everything we have examined so far, trade, technology, currency, narrative, and now global alliances, ultimately converges on a single geographic point, a place where every other file in this entire investigation collides at once, where economic interdependence, military deterrence, and national identity all meet in the most volatile possible combination. A small island sitting barely 100 miles off China's coastline, producing more of the world's most advanced semiconductors than any other place on Earth, and claimed by Beijing as an inseparable part of its own sovereign territory. That island is Taiwan, and it may be the single most dangerous file in this entire war. Chapter 9 begins now. Chapter 9. The Taiwan File, the flashpoint of the century. Phase 1, the setup. Open the file, and this time, imagine a live broadcast, the kind military analysts watch in real time from secure operations centers, tracking dozens of aircraft crossing an invisible line in the sky above a narrow stretch of water, separating an island from the mainland it once formed a single country with. Fighter jets cross into airspace, claimed but not fully controlled by the island's own defense forces. Warships maneuver in formations that defense analysts recognize instantly as rehearsals, not for a training exercise in the abstract sense, but for something far more specific: a blockade, or worse, an invasion. This is not an isolated one-time event. It has become, with increasing frequency in recent years, something closer to routine, a steady drumbeat of military pressure applied against a single island that most of the world had, for decades, managed to mostly ignore. Now hold this single, almost unbelievable number in your mind. A single company operating from a handful of factories clustered along that island's western coastline manufactures more than 9 out of every 10 of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips. The tiny objects we examined all the way back in Chapter 3, objects without which modern militaries cannot function, modern economies cannot operate, and modern artificial intelligence systems cannot be trained at all. This island's name is Taiwan, and inside this file it may represent the single most dangerous, most consequential flashpoint anywhere on Earth, a place where every other investigation in this entire series ultimately converges at once. Phase 2. The escalation to understand why this small island carries such enormous weight. We have to open a historical file stretching back to the Chinese Civil War of the 1940s, when the defeated nationalist government retreated to Taiwan after losing control of the mainland to the Communist Party, establishing a separate governing administration on the island that has continued in one form or another for more than 7 decades since. China's government has never recognized Taiwan as a separate, sovereign nation. Beijing considers the island an inseparable part of Chinese territory, temporarily separated by historical circumstance, and has repeatedly stated that reunification by peaceful means if possible, but by force if deemed necessary, remains a core, non-negotiable national objective. The United States, meanwhile, has spent decades pursuing a deliberately ambiguous policy toward the island, a strategy analysts have come to call strategic ambiguity. Washington formally acknowledges China's position that there is only one China, while simultaneously maintaining extensive unofficial relations with Taiwan, including a long-standing commitment, codified in domestic American law, to provide the island with weapons and defensive military equipment sufficient to maintain its own credible deterrent capability. This deliberate ambiguity has one very specific purpose. By refusing to state clearly whether the United States would intervene militarily in the event of a Chinese attempt to forcibly reunify the island, Washington hopes to simultaneously deter Beijing from ever attempting such an attack, while also discouraging Taiwan's own government from ever formally declaring outright independence, an act Beijing has repeatedly stated would itself trigger immediate military action. The strategy depends entirely on both sides remaining permanently uncertain about the other's true intentions, a deliberately unstable equilibrium that has remarkably held for more than 4 decades. Military analysts and defense planners on both sides of the Pacific have spent years quietly wargaming several distinct scenarios for how this uncertain equilibrium could eventually break down. The first scenario involves a full naval and air blockade of the island, cutting off its access to international shipping and energy imports without a single traditional invasion ever taking place, attempting to force Taiwan's government into political concessions through economic strangulation alone, while calculating that a blockade might avoid triggering the kind of decisive military response a full invasion almost certainly would. The second scenario involves a rapid, overwhelming military assault intended to seize key government and military installations within days, before the United States and its allies could organize any meaningful military response, betting everything on speed and surprise to present the world with a fait accompli before outside intervention becomes practically possible. And the third scenario, one that many analysts consider the most likely in the near term, involves what has come to be called gray zone warfare, a slow, deniable, incremental campaign combining cyber attacks, economic pressure, disinformation, and continuous military intimidation just below the threshold that would clearly trigger a formal, unambiguous international military response, gradually eroding Taiwan's political stability and international support over years, rather than forcing a single dramatic confrontation. Any of these scenarios would immediately draw in a wider circle of regional powers. Japan maintains formal treaty obligations with the United States and has increasingly signaled through its own domestic policy statements that a crisis in Taiwan would be treated as a direct threat to Japan's own national security, given the island's proximity to Japanese territory and shipping lanes. Australia and the Philippines maintain their own separate defense treaty commitments with the United States, commitments that could draw both nations into any broader regional conflict far more directly than either government might prefer. China's government has consistently framed this entire situation using language that leaves little room for ambiguity from Beijing's own perspective. The Taiwan question, Chinese officials repeatedly state, represents an absolute internal matter of Chinese sovereignty, no different in principle from any other nation's right to determine the fate of its own recognized territory, and one that no foreign power has any legitimate standing to interfere with. The United States and its allies frame the situation in almost entirely opposite terms, describing Taiwan not merely as an isolated regional dispute, but as a critical test case for an entire global order built around the principle that international disputes should be resolved through negotiation and established law, rather than through unilateral military force, a principle they argue underpins the stability of the entire post-World War II international system, far beyond Taiwan's borders alone. Both sides, notably, are arguing from within genuinely coherent, internally consistent worldviews. This is not a dispute between an obviously reasonable position and an obviously unreasonable one. It is a collision between two fundamentally incompatible visions of sovereignty and international order, each backed by serious, sincere conviction, and each backed by enormous calculated strategic interest as well. Phase 3. The resolution and the hook. So what would actually happen to the global economy in purely practical terms if this uncertain equilibrium finally broke down into open conflict? Economic modeling conducted by multiple international research institutions in recent years has produced estimates ranging from severe to catastrophic, depending on the scenario examined. A full-scale military conflict over Taiwan, most models agree, would immediately halt the vast majority of global semiconductor production coming from the island's factories and triggering shortages across every industry examined throughout this entire investigation series, from consumer electronics to automobiles to advanced military systems themselves, creating a deeply ironic scenario in which a war fought partly over control of chip manufacturing capacity would simultaneously destroy the very manufacturing capacity both sides were fighting to control. Beyond the direct disruption to chip supply, broader economic modeling suggests that a serious regional conflict could trigger global economic losses measured in the trillions of dollars, disrupting shipping lanes responsible for a substantial share of all global maritime trade, and potentially drawing the United States, China, and multiple allied nations into a direct military confrontation between two nuclear-armed powers, a scenario with genuinely unpredictable, potentially catastrophic escalation risks that extend far beyond any purely economic calculation. This is precisely why so much diplomatic and military energy on both sides of the Pacific remains focused not on resolving the underlying dispute, an outcome that currently appears essentially impossible given each side's fundamentally incompatible core positions, but simply on managing and prolonging the uncertain equilibrium for as long as possible, delaying confrontation year after year in the hope that changing circumstances might eventually make some future resolution more achievable than it appears today. And here's where this file must pause, because before we can honestly assess how likely open conflict over Taiwan truly is, we need to examine something this investigation has not yet fully opened: the internal condition of both superpowers themselves. Wars, historically, are rarely fought purely from positions of external strategic calculation alone. They are frequently shaped, sometimes decisively, by internal pressures, economic strain, political instability, and leadership calculations about domestic survival, factors that rarely make it into public statements about sovereignty and international law. Before we return to the question of open conflict, we need to look inward at the quiet cracks forming beneath both giants. cracks that may ultimately matter more to this entire rivalry's final outcome than any single island in the Pacific ever could. Chapter 10 begins now. Chapter 10: The Cracks Within, Real Estate Bubbles, National Debt, and a Crisis of Trust. Phase 1: The Setup. Open the file, and this time travel to a Chinese city built for millions of residents who, when the cameras arrived, simply were not there. Rows of finished apartment towers stand empty against the skyline, streetlights illuminate roads with almost no traffic passing beneath them, and shopping centers built to serve entire neighborhoods sit largely vacant, waiting for a population that development plans had promised, but that never actually arrived in the numbers originally projected. Journalists and researchers documenting these locations gave them a nickname that stuck immediately in the global imagination: ghost cities. Entire urban developments built ahead of demand that in many cases never fully materialized. And then, in the year 2021, one of China's largest and most aggressive real estate developers, a company that had spent years borrowing enormous sums of money to fund rapid, continuous expansion, found itself unable to meet its debt obligations, revealing liabilities reportedly exceeding $300 billion, one of the largest corporate debt loads in modern global history. The company's collapse sent shockwaves through China's financial system, triggered a broader crisis of confidence across the entire Chinese property sector, and forced international investors to confront an uncomfortable question they had spent years avoiding: how much of China's celebrated economic growth over the previous 2 decades had actually been built on a foundation of unsustainable real estate speculation, rather than genuine, durable economic productivity. This file opens with that specific case study for a reason, because to understand the true balance of power in this entire rivalry, we cannot only examine trade wars, semiconductor exports, and military posturing across the Pacific. We also have to open the books on both superpowers themselves and ask a far more uncomfortable question: how much internal weakness is quietly eating away at each side, even as both continue projecting confidence and strength outward to the rest of the world? Phase 2: The escalation. China's extraordinary economic growth over the past several decades relied heavily on an economic model in which local governments, restricted from raising revenue through many conventional taxation methods, financed a substantial share of public infrastructure and services by selling land use rights to real estate developers, who then built enormous quantities of new housing, financed largely through debt, betting on continuously rising property values and continuously rising demand to make the entire system sustainable over time. For years, this model appeared to work brilliantly. Rapid urbanization, rising household incomes, and a cultural tradition strongly favoring home ownership as the primary vehicle for family savings all combined to keep demand for new housing extraordinarily strong. But the model contained a structural vulnerability that became increasingly difficult to ignore as it matured. It required continuous, ever-expanding construction and continuously rising prices simply to remain financially stable, a pattern economists frequently compare to certain unsustainable financial structures that eventually collapse once new demand can no longer keep pace with existing obligations. By the early 2020s, China's property sector, which at its peak had accounted for a remarkably large share of the country's entire gross domestic product, when construction, related industries, and household wealth effects were all counted together, began confronting a demand problem that no amount of additional construction could solve. China simply did not have enough new home buyers left to absorb the enormous inventory of housing already built or still under construction, a problem compounded by a demographic crisis unfolding in parallel and largely independent of the real estate sector itself. China's population, according to its own official statistics, began declining in recent years for the first time in decades, following a sustained, dramatic drop in birth rates driven by rising urban living costs, extended workforce participation among women, and lingering demographic effects from decades of the country's former one-child policy. China's working-age population, the economic engine that powered the country's extraordinary manufacturing rise, is now shrinking, while its elderly population, requiring increasing healthcare and pension support, continues growing rapidly. Economists frequently describe this combination using an unsettling phrase, a demographic time bomb, a structural challenge that, unlike a currency crisis or a stock market correction, cannot be solved through any short-term policy intervention at all, since it stems from population trends already locked in decades ago and largely unchangeable now. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the Pacific, the United States confronts a very different but comparably serious set of internal vulnerabilities. America's national debt has climbed to record levels, repeatedly reigniting fierce political battles in Congress over raising the statutory debt ceiling, battles that have, on multiple occasions in recent years, pushed the United States government uncomfortably close to a technical default on its own financial obligations, an outcome that would send shockwaves through global financial markets, given the dollar's uniquely central role in the international financial system. We examined back in Chapter 5. Inflation following the global economic disruptions of the pandemic years surged to levels not seen in decades, eroding household purchasing power and forcing the Federal Reserve into an aggressive campaign of interest rate increases, raising borrowing costs across the entire American economy, from mortgages to business loans to the interest payments on the national debt itself. And beneath these purely economic pressures sits an even deeper structural challenge, a level of political polarization between America's two major political parties that has made basic legislative governance, funding the government, raising the debt ceiling, passing routine budgets, increasingly difficult and increasingly contentious, repeatedly pushing the country to the edge of government shutdowns and financial uncertainty over disputes that in earlier decades had typically been resolved through more routine bipartisan negotiation. And here is the central twist sitting at the very heart of this entire chapter, the one worth pausing on longer than almost anything else in this investigation. Both superpowers, while projecting confidence, strength, and strategic resolve outward toward each other and toward the rest of the world, are simultaneously grappling with serious, unresolved internal vulnerabilities of their own. Vulnerabilities that receive far less international attention than the trade wars, and chip restrictions and military posturing examined throughout the rest of this series. Some analysts have suggested, carefully and speculatively, that both governments may find genuine strategic value in maintaining external rivalry, precisely because it provides a convenient, unifying narrative, a way to channel domestic frustration outward toward a foreign rival, rather than allowing that frustration to focus more directly on internal governance failures at home. This file cannot prove definitively that either government is deliberately manufacturing external conflict purely to distract from internal weakness. Motivations of this kind are extraordinarily difficult to establish with certainty, even for the most experienced intelligence analysts. But the pattern itself, external rivalry intensifying at precisely the moments internal economic and political pressure also intensifies, appears clearly enough on both sides that it deserves serious consideration as at least a partial explanation for why this rivalry has continued escalating, even when de-escalation would arguably serve both economies better. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So what does this internal fragility on both sides of the Pacific ultimately mean for the broader trajectory of this entire rivalry? It means that neither superpower currently stands on ground nearly as stable as its public diplomatic posture might suggest. China's leadership must navigate an extraordinarily difficult economic transition, moving away from a real estate and export-driven growth model that increasingly cannot be sustained toward a new, still uncertain foundation for future growth, all while managing a demographic decline that will only intensify with each passing year. The United States must navigate mounting fiscal pressure, persistent political dysfunction, and a domestic population increasingly skeptical of the very international economic engagement that built much of the country's post-war prosperity in the first place. Either side's internal vulnerabilities could, under the wrong combination of circumstances, trigger a genuinely destabilizing financial event, what analysts sometimes call a black swan, an unpredictable shock capable of rippling outward across the entire interconnected global economy, regardless of which side that shock originates from. And here's where this file must pause, because if both superpowers are in fact weaker and more vulnerable internally than their external rhetoric suggests, a deeper question emerges, one that reaches beyond trade statistics, military posturing, and economic data entirely. Why continue escalating a rivalry this costly and this dangerous and this potentially destabilizing for both sides at all, if de-escalation would arguably serve both economies better? And the answer lies not in any single policy decision, any single tariff, or any single military exercise. It lies in something far older, something historians and strategists have observed repeating itself across centuries of great power competition, a pattern so consistent that it has earned its own name in the study of international relations. To understand why this rivalry may never simply resolve itself through rational compromise alone, we need to step back from the specific details of trade, technology, and territory entirely and examine the deeper historical logic of power itself, the pattern that has governed the collision between rising and established great powers since long before either the United States or modern China ever existed. Chapter 11 begins now. Chapter 11, The Logic of Power, Why This Is Not a War Easily Solved by Compromise. Phase 1, the setup, open the file, and this time step back from every single case study we have examined so far, the tariffs, the chips, the ports, the currencies, and travel instead into the pages of ancient history to a war fought nearly 2,500 years ago between two Greek city-states. A historian named Thucydides, writing about the conflict between Athens and Sparta, offered an observation so precise, so uncomfortably repeatable across the centuries that followed, that modern strategists still use his name to describe the exact pattern unfolding between Washington and Beijing today. Thucydides wrote that the true underlying cause of that ancient war was not any single dispute, treaty violation, or diplomatic insult. It was something structural, something almost mechanical. The growth of Athenian power and the fear that growth produced inside Sparta, the established power watching a rival rise. Modern political scientists have given this pattern a name, the Thucydides trap. A rising power's growing strength inevitably generates fear inside an established power, and that fear, whether justified or exaggerated, frequently drives both sides toward confrontation, even when neither side genuinely wants war, and even when both sides would rationally benefit far more from continued peaceful cooperation. Researchers studying this pattern across the past 5 centuries of recorded history examined 16 separate cases in which a rising power's growth directly threatened to overtake an established dominant power. In 12 of those 16 cases, the resulting tension eventually erupted into open war. In only 4 cases did both sides manage to navigate the transition peacefully, 12 out of 16. If that historical pattern holds, the United States and China may currently be walking one of the most well-documented, most dangerous paths in the entire history of international relations, a path with historical odds weighted heavily, uncomfortably, toward eventual conflict rather than peaceful accommodation. Phase 2, the escalation let us open the historical case files that make this pattern feel less like abstract theory and more like a warning written in blood, decades before either the United States or modern China existed as we know them today. In the years leading up to the First World War, a rapidly industrializing German empire began rapidly expanding its naval fleet, directly challenging the long-standing British Royal Navy's dominance over global sea lanes. Britain, the established global power of that era, watched Germany's rising industrial and military strength with escalating anxiety, eventually entering into a network of alliances specifically designed to contain German ambitions. Neither Britain nor Germany initially sought a continent-wide war. The assassination of a single archduke in Sarajevo became the immediate spark, but the underlying structural tension and established power's fear of a rapidly rising rival had already built the tinder that single spark eventually ignited. Decades later, following the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union entered into a different kind of great power rivalry, one that, remarkably, managed to avoid direct military conflict between the two superpowers themselves for more than 4 decades, despite building enough combined nuclear weaponry to end civilization many times over. The Cold War offers this file its most important counterexample, proof that the Thucydides trap, while historically common, is not inevitable, that rising and established powers can, under the right conditions, manage intense, sustained rivalry without ever crossing into direct, catastrophic war. What made the Cold War different, and what many strategists now study closely for lessons applicable to the current rivalry, was the presence of clear, mutually understood deterrence, extensive, if often strained, diplomatic communication channels, and crucially, a shared recognition on both sides that direct war between two nuclear-armed superpowers would produce no meaningful winner at all, only mutual annihilation. So where does the current rivalry between the United States and China actually sit within this historical pattern? And what do the strategic minds shaping policy in both Washington and Beijing actually believe about where it is heading? China's own long-term strategic vision has been articulated clearly and consistently by its leadership over the past decade, organized around a set of specific national milestones, frequently described using the phrase the China Dream. Envisioning China achieving what officials describe as full national rejuvenation by the year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China itself. This vision explicitly includes reclaiming what Beijing considers China's rightful position as a leading global power, a position Chinese officials frequently argue was unjustly denied to the country during a period they describe as a century of humiliation, following forced trade concessions and territorial losses to Western and Japanese imperial powers during the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Washington, meanwhile, an unusually consistent bipartisan consensus has emerged around treating China as the United States' most significant long-term strategic competitor, a rare point of genuine agreement between political parties that otherwise struggle to agree on almost any other major policy question, as we already observed back in Chapter 6, where two ideologically opposed administrations pursued remarkably similar China policies, despite sharp disagreement on nearly everything else. Scholars studying this rivalry have generally split into two broad camps, offering sharply different predictions about where it ultimately leads. Scholars working within what is commonly called the realist tradition of international relations argue that great power conflict of this kind is, in a meaningful sense, structurally inevitable, driven by the fundamental architecture of an international system with no higher authority capable of enforcing peaceful resolution between rival great powers. From this perspective, the United States and China are simply following a pattern as old as organized human civilization itself, one that diplomatic goodwill and economic interdependence can slow but cannot ultimately prevent. Scholars working within what is commonly called the institutionalist tradition offer a more hopeful counterargument, pointing to the extensive network of international institutions, trade agreements, and diplomatic frameworks built since the end of the Second World War, specifically to manage exactly this kind of great power tension. From this perspective, the United States and China possess far more tools for peaceful accommodation than any previous rival powers in history ever had access to, and choosing conflict over continued strategic competition within those existing frameworks would represent a genuine, avoidable policy failure, not an unavoidable historical inevitability. And here finally is the twist, sitting at the very center of this entire chapter. The question this file wants you to sit with longer than almost any other question raised throughout this whole investigation. Is this genuinely a clash of fundamentally incompatible political ideologies, democratic governance against authoritarian control, as both governments frequently frame it in their public messaging campaigns examined back in Chapter 7? Or is it, underneath all of that ideological framing, something considerably older and more familiar? A struggle over finite resources, markets, and strategic territory, the same underlying struggle that has driven great power rivalry throughout recorded history, simply dressed in the specific ideological language that happens to be fashionable in this particular century. This file cannot offer you a single definitive answer, because honest historical analysis rarely allows for one. But consider this. The United States has, at various points across its own history, maintained close strategic partnerships with authoritarian governments whenever doing so served clear strategic interests, and China has, at various points, engaged in extensive economic cooperation with democratic nations whenever doing so served its own clear economic interests. Ideology, in practice, appears to function less as the fundamental cause of this rivalry and more as a convenient, emotionally powerful language used to explain and justify a competition whose deeper roots lie in something considerably more concrete: control over technology, control over trade routes, control over currency, and control over the strategic territory examined throughout every single chapter of this investigation so far. Phase 3, the resolution and the hook. So, what does this deeper historical logic ultimately mean for how this rivalry is likely to unfold in the years ahead? It means the world should not expect a single decisive resolution, a clear winner, or a clean surrender from either side. Historical great power rivalries of this scale rarely end that way. Instead, the most likely trajectory, based on the historical patterns and internal vulnerabilities examined throughout this entire investigation, points toward a prolonged, multi-decade competition, often described by historians and strategists as a new kind of Cold War, one fought primarily through economics, technology, and strategic alliances rather than direct military confrontation between the two superpowers themselves, punctuated by periodic moments of acute danger, particularly around the Taiwan flashpoint, examined back in Chapter 9, but without necessarily culminating in the kind of full-scale, continent-spanning war that characterized the first half of the 20th century. This is, in the language of this file, neither the most reassuring possible outcome nor the most catastrophic one. It is simply the outcome the available historical evidence currently makes most probable. And here is where this file must pause one final time before we open the last chapter of this entire investigation, because everything examined across the previous 10 chapters raises one remaining question. This series has not yet directly answered. What does all of this actually mean in practical terms for the billions of people who are not sitting inside the White House or inside the halls of Beijing's leadership compound, but who nonetheless live, work, invest, and raise families squarely within the blast radius of this entire rivalry? What happens next? Who, if anyone, ultimately wins, and where exactly does that leave you? Chapter 12, the final chapter of this investigation, begins now. Chapter 12, the map of the future. Who wins, who loses, and what the world will look like. Phase 1, the setup. Open the final file in this investigation, and this time imagine a room that does not exist yet, sometime around the year 2035, where a small group of strategists, economists, and intelligence analysts sit around a table covered in maps, charts, and briefing papers, tasked with a single, nearly impossible question. How did this entire rivalry actually turn out? They do not have one answer. They have three. And every serious research institution studying this rivalry today has, in one form or another, sketched out some version of these same three futures. Phase 2, the escalation. The first future sitting on that table is what analysts frequently call parallel coexistence, a world in which the United States and China never resolve their fundamental rivalry, but never allow it to collapse into direct military conflict either. Instead, two largely separate technological and economic ecosystems, the split we first examined back in Chapter 3, continue solidifying over the following decade. One ecosystem, built around American semiconductor design, American financial infrastructure, and a network of traditional allies in Europe and the Pacific, continues operating largely as it does today. A second ecosystem, built around Chinese manufacturing, Chinese payment infrastructure, and an expanding network of partners across the developing world, continues growing in parallel, slower in cutting-edge innovation, but increasingly self-sufficient and increasingly large in absolute economic scale. Under this future, global growth slows somewhat compared to the fully integrated global economy of the previous 3 decades, since duplicated supply chains and restricted technology transfer both introduce genuine economic inefficiency. But the world avoids catastrophic conflict and gradually adjusts to operating within two coexisting, only loosely connected economic systems, not entirely unlike the way the world once adjusted to operating within the two separate blocks of the original Cold War. The second future sitting on that table is considerably more dramatic, an outcome in which China's economy, despite the internal vulnerabilities examined back in Chapter 10, successfully navigates its demographic decline and real estate correction, achieves genuine technological self-sufficiency in the critical sectors examined throughout this investigation, and ultimately surpasses the United States as the world's largest, most technologically advanced economy sometime before the middle of this century. Several serious economic conditions would need to align for this future to actually materialize. China would need to successfully transition away from its debt-driven real estate growth model toward a new foundation built on genuine domestic innovation and consumer spending. A transition many economists studying China's current trajectory consider extraordinarily difficult, though not impossible, given the scale of restructuring required. China would also need to close the remaining gap in cutting-edge semiconductor manufacturing, examined back in Chapter 3, a gap that, despite genuine progress, still separates China's most advanced domestic chip production from the industry's absolute technological frontier. And China would need to manage its demographic decline without the kind of severe long-term economic drag that most historical precedents involving rapidly aging populations elsewhere in the world would strongly suggest is likely. Each of these conditions individually is achievable. All three occurring together on the timeline this future scenario would require represents a considerably steeper challenge, one that most economists studying China's current trajectory consider possible, but far from the most probable outcome based on currently available evidence. The third future sitting on that table is the darkest one, and the one every strategist in that hypothetical room would most desperately want to avoid discussing in detail. A future in which the Taiwan flashpoint examined back in Chapter 9 finally breaks the fragile equilibrium that has held for more than 4 decades, triggering direct military conflict between the United States and China, either directly or through a rapidly escalating regional crisis that eventually draws both superpowers in against their own original intentions. The economic modeling for this scenario, briefly touched on back in Chapter 9, remains genuinely difficult to overstate. Global semiconductor supply chains collapsing overnight, global shipping lanes disrupted across the entire Indo-Pacific region, potential direct military confrontation between two nuclear-armed powers, carrying escalation risks that extend far beyond any calculable economic damage alone. This future represents by a wide margin the outcome every serious analyst studying this rivalry hopes remains the least probable of the three. Even as the military buildups and diplomatic tensions examined throughout Chapter 9 continue, making it impossible to dismiss entirely. But here is a crucial element missing from all three of these superpower-centered scenarios. One, this file must correct before closing this investigation completely, because the future of this rivalry will not be determined solely by decisions made in Washington and Beijing alone. A third set of actors, countries and regions not directly steering this rivalry, but increasingly positioned to benefit from it, regardless of how it ultimately resolves, deserves serious attention in its own right. India, with its enormous and still growing working-age population, standing in sharp demographic contrast to China's own aging workforce, examined back in Chapter 10, has increasingly positioned itself as an attractive alternative manufacturing and technology hub, benefiting directly from the friendshoring trends examined back in Chapter 6. The European Union, despite the internal tensions and divided loyalties examined back in Chapter 8, retains enormous collective economic and technological weight and could, under the right circumstances, position itself as a genuinely independent third pole in this rivalry, rather than simply an extension of American strategic interests. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, navigating the delicate balancing act, examined back in Chapter 8, continues attracting investment and strategic courtship from both superpowers simultaneously, extracting genuine economic benefit from a rivalry it did not create and cannot fully control. And across Africa, nations receiving competing infrastructure investment and competing diplomatic attention from both Washington and Beijing find themselves, for the first time in generations, holding genuine negotiating leverage, precisely because two competing superpowers are courting their partnership rather than simply dictating terms to them. This rivalry, in other words, is not simply a story about two countries locked in a zero-sum contest. It is also, quietly, redistributing global economic and strategic influence toward a wider, more diverse set of nations than the world has seen in generations. An unintended consequence that may ultimately prove just as historically significant as whichever specific outcome eventually plays out between Washington and Beijing themselves. Phase 3, the conclusion. So after 11 chapters of blueprints, chips, currencies, ports, and islands, what is the single conclusion this entire investigation ultimately points toward? There is no single winner waiting at the end of this file. That is, perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable conclusion this entire investigation has to offer. This is not a courtroom drama building toward a clean, satisfying verdict. It is closer to a long, grinding negotiation without a final signature, a contest in which both sides will very likely absorb serious permanent costs, regardless of which of the three futures examined in this chapter ultimately comes closest to reality. What this investigation can offer you, instead of a tidy conclusion, is something more useful, a clearer map of exactly how this rivalry actually works, beneath the headlines, beneath the political slogans, beneath the simplified narratives examined back in Chapter 7 that both governments have spent years constructing for their own respective audiences. Tariffs are not simply punishments. They are negotiating tools with real, measurable costs landing on real people, as we saw in Chapter 6. Semiconductor restrictions are not simply technical trade policy. They are calculated moves in a decades-long strategic contest over the literal building blocks of modern power, as we saw in Chapter 3. And neither superpower is anywhere near as unified, as stable, or as confident behind closed doors as its public diplomatic messaging would have the rest of the world believe, as we saw clearly back in Chapter 10. Understanding this rivalry clearly does not mean picking a side, and this investigation has deliberately avoided telling you which side deserves your loyalty. It means something more valuable than loyalty: the ability to look past the simplified, emotionally charged narratives being deliberately constructed on both sides of the Pacific, and to see the underlying strategic logic, the genuine grievances, and the genuine internal vulnerabilities driving decisions on both sides at once. Because here is the final, closing question this entire investigation ultimately leaves you with. One, no chapter in this file can answer on your behalf. In a world increasingly organized around two competing centers of power, each with genuine strengths, genuine weaknesses, and genuinely incompatible visions for how the future should be governed, what role will you choose to play? As an investor deciding where to place capital. As a professional deciding which skills and industries to build a career around. As a citizen deciding which narratives to trust and which to question more carefully. This file does not close with a verdict. It closes with a mirror held up toward you, the listener who has followed this entire investigation from the very first page of the opening file all the way to this final line. The case remains open. The outcome remains unwritten. And the next chapter of this story, unlike the 12 you have just finished, has not been decided yet. This file is now closed.